My aunt accused me of getting her pregnant and demanded $50,000 in child support. My sister, the golden child, and I took her to court and found out. I've been meaning to get this off my chest for a while. It feels like every year I convince myself to just forget it, to move on and let the past stay in the past. But I can't. So, here I am. If anyone has advice or just wants to tell me to move on, I'd appreciate hearing it. I grew up in a pretty standard suburban neighborhood. From the outside, everything looked fine. My parents, Ava and John, had steady jobs and a nice home. But inside that house, things were different. And, honestly, it all started the day my little sister was born. Her name is Emma. She was the golden child, literally from the moment she came into the world. Before she even took her first steps, it was like my parents forgot I existed. I'm 3 years older than her, so I was old enough to remember what it felt like to be their center of attention before she came along. I guess I never thought it would be taken away from me so suddenly. Before Emma, my mom used to read to me every night. My dad and I would play catch in the backyard almost every weekend. Normal stuff. But after she was born, it all stopped. My parents were obsessed with her, like she was some kind of miracle. I get it. Babies need attention. But the way they treated her compared to me, it was like night and day. At first, I thought maybe I was just imagining it. Maybe I was just being a jealous kid. But it got worse as we got older. Emma was one of those kids who was naturally good at everything. Straight-A student, talented in sports, popular at school. You name it, she excelled. And my parents? Oh man, they were her biggest fans. They'd attend every single one of her soccer games, make a huge fuss over her report cards, hang every piece of art she brought home on the fridge. Me? Not so much. I wasn't bad at school, but I wasn't Emma. I got decent grades, had friends, and tried my best in everything I did, but it never seemed to be enough for them. I remember one time I came home with a B+ on my math test, and I was actually proud of it because I'd been struggling in that class for weeks. My dad just looked at it, nodded, and said, "Next time, shoot for an A." Meanwhile, Emma could walk into the house with a random trophy she picked up from God knows what activity, and they'd throw a party. It was like they couldn't see me. They saw Emma. They saw their perfect child who could do no wrong. But me? I was background noise. Things really hit a breaking point in high school. By then, Emma was the top of her class, homecoming queen, star athlete. All the things my parents lived for. I, on the other hand, was struggling. Not just academically, but emotionally. I tried talking to them once, just to get their attention. I remember telling my mom I was having trouble concentrating in school, that I felt lonely, that maybe I needed help. She barely looked up from her phone. She just said, "Well, you'll figure it out. You always do," and went back to texting someone. I didn't even try telling my dad. He was too busy obsessing over some soccer camp Emma was getting into. So, I learned to keep to myself. If they weren't going to pay attention to me, I figured I didn't need them to. I focused on my own life, did what I had to do to get through school, and made plans to leave as soon as I graduated. I applied to colleges far away from home and didn't tell them until I got accepted. I ended up getting into a school about 5 hours away. They didn't care. They were more concerned about whether Emma would follow in my footsteps or stay local to pursue her sports career. The day I left for college was bittersweet. On one hand, I was excited to finally get away from them, from the constant comparison to Emma. But on the other hand, it felt like a part of me was giving up. Like I was admitting that my parents were never going to see me the way they saw her. They didn't even drive me to school. I packed my own car, drove myself, and moved into my dorm on my own. No tears, no good luck hugs, nothing. College was supposed to be a fresh start. I was determined to reinvent myself, to become someone who didn't care about his parents' approval. But that's the thing about childhood trauma. It doesn't just go away because you change your surroundings. I made some friends, went to classes, did all the normal college stuff. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still that kid, still the one my parents didn't care about. After my first year of school, I decided to stay in the city where my college was located instead of going back home for the summer. I got a job as a waiter and rented a cheap apartment with some friends. I didn't even bother telling my parents. When they didn't call to ask why I wasn't coming home, I knew I'd made the right choice. And here's where things get complicated. One night during the summer, I got a call from Emma. I hadn't heard from her in months, which wasn't unusual. She had her own life, and I had mine. But when I answered, she was crying. Hysterical. Actually, at first, I thought something terrible had happened, like an accident or something, but it wasn't that. She told me that our parents had found out she'd been secretly dating one of her teammates, a girl. I was stunned. I never knew Emma was into girls, but it didn't matter. What mattered was how our parents reacted. They freaked out, completely lost their minds, and kicked her out of the house. It didn't surprise me that they reacted poorly, but kicking her out? That was a new low, even for them. She didn't know where else to go, so she drove to my apartment and basically begged me to let her crash with me for a while. I didn't hesitate. As much as I resented her for the way our parents favored her, she was still my sister, and she was in trouble. I let her stay with me, and for the first time in my life, I saw Emma for who she really was. Not the perfect, untouchable golden child, but a scared, confused teenager who didn't know where else to turn. She stayed with me for a few weeks, and during that time, we actually started to get close. We talked about everything. Our childhood, our parents, the pressure she'd always felt to be perfect. It turns out she wasn't as happy as she seemed. She'd been miserable, trying to live up to their expectations. And now that she was finally free of them, she didn't know who she was anymore. It was weird. For years, I'd been jealous of her, of the attention she got, of the way our parents treated her like she was better than me. But now, seeing her broken down and vulnerable, I didn't feel that way anymore. I felt sorry for her. Our parents had messed her up just as much as they'd messed me up, maybe even more. But just as we were starting to bond, things took a dark turn. One night, I came home from work and Emma was gone. At first, I thought maybe she'd just gone out to get some air or something, but when I tried calling her, she didn't answer. Hours passed, and I started to panic. I called her again and again, but it went straight to voicemail. I even called our parents to see if they'd heard from her, but they hadn't. It wasn't until the next morning that I got a call from the police. Emma had been found in a park, passed out after what looked like a failed suicide attempt. She had taken a bunch of pills and left a note in her car, saying she couldn't live with the shame anymore. I was devastated. All those years I'd been angry at her, thinking she had the perfect life, and she'd been struggling just as much as I had. Maybe more. She survived, thank God, but she was in the hospital for a while after that. My parents, of course, didn't show up. They couldn't even be bothered to check on her. After that, things were never the same. I cut my parents out of my life completely. They didn't care about me before, and they sure as hell didn't care about Emma now that she wasn't their perfect little girl anymore. Emma and I stayed close, though. We both moved on in our own ways, but I'll never forget what happened during those weeks. It changed everything for me. I've been thinking about what happened after my last post, and I realized that what I shared was only half the story. So, I figured it was time for an update. Things didn't magically get better after I cut off my parents. In fact, things got a lot more complicated. This might get long, but I need to tell the whole story. After Emma's suicide attempt, everything felt like it was hanging by a thread. She was in the hospital for a few weeks, and during that time, I visited her every day. We didn't talk much at first. What was there to say? She was still processing everything, and I didn't know how to help. But being there, even in silence, seemed to be enough for her. When she finally got discharged, we both knew we couldn't just go back to how things were. She couldn't keep crashing at my place indefinitely, and I wasn't in a position to support both of us long-term. I was still working that waitressing job, living paycheck to paycheck in a rundown apartment. Emma didn't have a job anymore. Her parents cut her off financially, and she was too shaken to return to soccer or school. So, we needed a plan. We decided to start fresh. Emma and I had spent our entire lives living in the shadow of our parents' expectations, but now we had a chance to make something of ourselves on our own terms. We both found entry-level jobs at a marketing firm in the city. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. I was doing admin work, answering phones, filing reports, basically grunt work, and Emma, despite her talents, took a similar position, working on basic client research. At first, it was tough. The pay was low, and neither of us had any real experience in the corporate world. We were working long hours just to stay afloat. Our apartment was tiny, barely big enough for the two of us, and we could hear every creak of the floorboards from the neighbors upstairs. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like we were building something together. But then came the setbacks. About 6 months into our new jobs, Emma hit a wall. She'd been struggling with depression and anxiety since the suicide attempt, and working in a fast-paced, high-pressure environment wasn't helping. She started having panic attacks at work, sometimes right in the middle of a meeting or when we were under a tight deadline. It was hard to watch. My once invincible sister, who had always seemed like she could handle anything, was breaking down in front of me. I tried to support her as best I could, but I was barely keeping it together myself. Work was brutal. The boss we worked for, a guy named Mark, was notorious for being a hard ass. He didn't care about personal issues or mental health. He just wanted results. If you didn't deliver, you were out. No exceptions. I remember one time, Emma had to leave early because she felt a panic attack coming on, and Mark went ballistic. He called her unreliable in front of the entire office. I could see how much it hurt her, but I knew we couldn't afford for her to quit. Around this time, I realized I needed to do something drastic to get us out of this cycle. So, I started taking online classes in digital marketing. I figured if I could get certified, I could climb the ranks faster and maybe make enough money to help Emma out more. I didn't tell her at first because I didn't want to stress her out even more. I'd study late at night after work, exhausted but determined to find a way out. And then came the first real break. I landed a promotion. It wasn't anything huge, but I was moved into a junior marketing role, which meant more responsibility and a small pay bump. For the first time, it felt like we were making progress. I could finally afford to cover more of the bills, and Emma didn't have to push herself as hard at work. She cut back her hours, focusing on getting therapy and taking care of her mental health. But, of course, nothing good lasts forever. One morning, about a year into our new lives, I got a call from Emma while I was at work. She was hysterical, and for a moment, I thought she might have tried something again. But when I finally got her to calm down, she told me that one of our old high school classmates, a guy named Jake, had reached out to her. Apparently, Jake had heard about her being disowned by our parents and decided to swoop in like a knight in shining armor. He offered her a place to stay, promised her he could help her get her life back on track. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured Jake was just being kind, but something about the way Emma talked about him made me uneasy. She seemed too eager to get away from everything, to start over again, this time with Jake. I tried to talk her out of it, telling her we were doing fine, that we didn't need anyone else's help, but Emma wasn't hearing it. She was convinced that Jake had the answers. A week later, she moved out of our apartment and into Jake's place. And that's when everything started to unravel. Jake wasn't the good guy he made himself out to be. He was controlling, manipulative, and it wasn't long before Emma became isolated again. She stopped returning my calls and started skipping work. I found out later that Jake had been encouraging her to cut ties with me, telling her that I was holding her back, that I was the reason she hadn't recovered. I tried to confront her, but she wouldn't listen. Every time I called or tried to visit, Jake would answer the door, saying Emma was busy or didn't want to talk. It was like she disappeared. For months, I barely heard from her. I was working long hours, trying to get ahead in my own career, but every day, I worried about her. Then one night, out of nowhere, Emma showed up at my apartment. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her clothes were wrinkled, her hair a mess, and she had dark circles under her eyes. She told me she'd left Jake. Apparently, things had gotten bad. He'd started getting violent, throwing things around when he didn't get his way, accusing her of cheating whenever she talked to anyone. She finally realized he wasn't the solution to her problems. He was just another one. I let her stay with me again, and slowly, we started rebuilding our lives for the second time. I helped her get back into therapy, and she found a new job, this time in a less stressful field, working at a nonprofit that helped young people struggling with mental health. It wasn't glamorous, but she loved it. It was something she was passionate about, and it gave her a sense of purpose. As for me, things started looking up at work. I continued taking classes and eventually landed a senior marketing role. It wasn't easy. There were plenty of setbacks along the way, but I kept pushing forward. My boss, Mark, even came around. After seeing the results I was delivering, He started giving me more responsibilities and even mentioned a potential promotion down the line. But even as things were improving, there was always that nagging feeling in the back of my mind. The feeling that no matter how far we'd come, the scars from our childhood were still there. Emma was doing better, but she still had her bad days. And I still couldn't bring myself to talk to my parents, not after everything they'd done. One of the hardest moments came when I got invited to a company event, some big corporate retreat where everyone brought their families. I didn't have anyone to invite. Emma was still rebuilding her life, and our parents? Well, they weren't even an option. I remember standing there, watching everyone else with their spouses, their kids, their parents, and feeling so incredibly alone. Even though I'd come so far, even though I'd built a life for myself, it still felt like something was missing. But then I remembered something Emma had told me once, back when she was at her lowest. She said, "We're all we've got." And she was right. As much as I wanted things to be different, as much as I wanted a normal family, I knew that Emma and I had each other, and that was enough. So, where am I now? Well, I'm still working at the marketing firm. I've moved up in my career and am making decent money. Emma's doing well at her job, and she's come a long way since those dark days. We still have our issues, who doesn't? But we're in a much better place now. But the truth is, the pain of being ignored by my parents, of growing up in Emma's shadow, it never really goes away. It's like a scar. You can cover it up, you can move on with your life, but it's always there, a reminder of everything that happened. This is probably going to be my last update, and to be honest, I never expected to get this far. When I first posted about my toxic relationship with my parents and how they treated Emma and me, I was just venting. I didn't think anything would really change. But here I am, years later, reflecting on how far we've come. If you've been following my story, then you know the hell we've gone through, and you also know how much we've struggled to rebuild our lives. Well, things took another turn, and I'm here to share how everything played out. After Emma left Jake and we started piecing our lives back together, we found some stability for the first time in what felt like forever. I'd been steadily climbing the ladder at the marketing firm, and Emma's work at the nonprofit was helping her recover from the emotional wreckage left behind by our parents. But it still didn't feel like enough. We were surviving, sure, but we weren't thriving. We wanted more out of life, more than just working for someone else and living paycheck to paycheck. The idea to start a business was one of those late-night conversations that neither of us took seriously at first. It was Emma who suggested it. She had grown tired of the corporate world, and her passion for helping people had sparked the idea that we could do something bigger. I wasn't sure what at first, but as we talked about it more, the pieces started to fall into place. We realized that, between the two of us, we had skills that could complement each other. I had experience in marketing and business, and Emma had a deep understanding of people and how to connect with them on a personal level. So, we started small. We pulled together what little savings we had and launched a marketing consulting firm that specialized in working with nonprofits and small businesses. The idea was simple. We'd help organizations with meaningful missions grow their reach and impact by offering affordable marketing services. It seemed like a no-brainer. Emma had the heart for it, and I had the skills to back it up. But, of course, nothing worth doing is easy. At first, it was a complete disaster. We didn't have the capital to hire anyone, so we were doing everything ourselves. I was designing marketing campaigns, building websites, and managing client accounts all at once, while Emma handled outreach, customer relations, and everything that fell under client support. We were working around the clock, sometimes pulling 18-hour days just to stay afloat. The stress was unbearable at times, and there were moments when I genuinely wondered if we'd made a mistake. The worst of it came during our first major client project. We landed a contract with a nonprofit that worked with at-risk youth, helping them gain access to educational resources and job opportunities. It was exactly the kind of project Emma and I had dreamed of working on, something that could make a real difference. But we quickly realized that we were in over our heads. The nonprofit had high expectations and very little patience. They wanted immediate results, and we simply weren't equipped to deliver at that scale. I remember one night, Emma and I sat in our tiny office, staring at our computer screens in silence, knowing that we were on the verge of losing the contract. It felt like everything we'd worked for was about to slip through our fingers. I don't know if it was sheer desperation or some kind of last-minute adrenaline rush, but we pulled an all-nighter, reworking the entire campaign from the ground up. We redesigned their website, launched new ad campaigns, and crafted a social media strategy that finally caught their attention. It worked. That project ended up being the turning point for our business. The nonprofit was so impressed with the results that they referred us to other organizations, and before we knew it, we had a steady stream of clients. But success came with its own set of challenges. The more clients we took on, the harder it became to manage everything on our own. We were still struggling with cash flow, and we couldn't afford to hire full-time employees, so we had to get creative. This is where we made our first major hire, a guy named Liam. He was a freelance graphic designer we'd worked with on a few small projects, and he seemed like a good fit for our team. We couldn't offer him much, just a part-time gig with the promise of more work down the line if things picked up. Liam was talented, but what we didn't know at the time was that he had a lot of personal baggage. He was going through a messy divorce and was barely holding himself together. At first, everything was fine. Liam was a great addition to the team, and his designs took our projects to the next level. But as his personal life spiraled out of control, it started bleeding into his work. He'd miss deadlines, show up late, and sometimes disappear for days without a word. I didn't want to fire him because I knew he was going through a rough patch, but we were a small business, and we couldn't afford to carry someone who wasn't pulling their weight. Things came to a head when Liam completely botched a major project for one of our biggest clients. He'd been tasked with designing a branding package for a startup, and when the deadline came, he handed in something that looked like it had been thrown together in an hour. The client was furious and threatened to pull the contract, which would have been a huge financial blow for us. I confronted Liam, and what I didn't expect was his complete meltdown. He broke down in the middle of the office, crying and admitting that he'd been drinking heavily and hadn't been able to focus on anything. I felt torn. Part of me wanted to fire him on the spot, but another part of me, maybe the part that had seen Emma go through her own dark times, knew that firing him wouldn't fix anything. So, instead, I gave him an ultimatum. I told him he needed to get help, to take some time off and sort out his personal issues. If he could come back to us with a clear head, we'd give him another chance. If not, we'd have to part ways. Liam agreed, and surprisingly, he followed through. He checked into rehab and took a month off to focus on his recovery. When he came back, he was like a different person. The transformation was incredible, and he became one of the most reliable members of our team. But the whole ordeal taught me a valuable lesson about the importance of boundaries and knowing when to step in before things get out of control. As the business grew, so did the challenges. We had a small team, but we were taking on more work than we could handle. Emma and I were still working insane hours, and the stress started taking a toll on our health. Emma, who had always struggled with anxiety, began having panic attacks again. I was constantly exhausted, and there were days when I didn't think I could keep going. That's when we made the decision to hire a business manager, someone who could take over the day-to-day operations so Emma and I could focus on the bigger picture. We brought in a woman named Nora, who had years of experience managing small businesses. Nora was a godsend. She took over the logistics, handled the finances, and made sure everything ran smoothly. For the first time in what felt like forever, Emma and I could breathe again. With Nora at the helm, the business thrived. We expanded our client base, hired more staff, and even opened a second office in another city. It was everything we dreamed of, and yet, there was still that lingering feeling of emptiness. Success didn't fix the deep-rooted issues we had with our past, and no matter how far we'd come, it didn't change the fact that we were still carrying the weight of everything that had happened to us. But then came the biggest twist of all. One day, out of the blue, our parents showed up at our office. I hadn't spoken to them in years, and I wasn't prepared for the wave of emotions that hit me when I saw them standing in the lobby. They looked older, more tired, and there was a kind of desperation in their eyes that I hadn't seen before. They wanted to talk, to apologize for everything they'd done, for the way they treated me and Emma. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to scream at them, to tell them that it was too late, that the damage was already done. But another part of me, maybe the part that had spent so many years seeking their approval, wanted to hear them out. So, we sat down, the four of us, in the conference room of the business that Emma and I had built from the ground up. Our parents apologized. They admitted that they'd been wrong, that they'd favored Emma and neglected me, that they hadn't been there for either of us when we needed them the most. It was a surreal moment, hearing the words I'd longed to hear for so long, and yet, they didn't bring the closure I thought they would. I never thought I'd be back here, updating this saga. I mean, things were finally looking up. My sister, Emma, and I had built a business from scratch, worked through all kinds of personal drama, and even managed to start healing from the trauma our parents had left us with. But I guess life had one more insane curveball to throw my way. I'm not even sure how to explain this, but I'll try. I just need to get it out, because honestly, I don't know what to do. Everything started about 6 months ago when my aunt, Lisa, showed up out of the blue. Lisa is my mom's younger sister, and growing up, she was always kind of a wild card. She was the kind of person who drifted in and out of our lives, never staying in one place for too long. Sometimes she'd be around for holidays or family events, but mostly she was off doing her own thing. She's never been close with any of us, and I hadn't seen her in years. So, when she turned up at my office, I was surprised, to say the least. At first, I thought she was just visiting, maybe trying to reconnect or something, but the moment she sat down, I knew something was off. She looked different, nervous, agitated. She wasn't making small talk or catching up. She got right to the point. And the point? She claimed she was pregnant. And not just that, she claimed the baby was mine. I swear, my heart stopped. I couldn't process what she was saying. This was my aunt, my mother's sister, and she was sitting in front of me, accusing me of getting her pregnant. It didn't make any sense. I mean, I hadn't seen her in years, and there was absolutely no way we had been involved like that. But she was adamant. She started laying out this insane story, saying that we'd hooked up at some family gathering last year, that we'd both been drinking, and one thing led to another. The problem? It never happened. Not once, not ever. I don't even drink like that, and I hadn't seen her at any family event in years. But Lisa wasn't backing down. She was convinced the baby was mine, or at least that's what she wanted me to believe. When I tried to tell her she was crazy, she just kept doubling down, getting more aggressive, saying she had proof and that I needed to take responsibility. She demanded $50,000 in child support, up front. No DNA test, no nothing. Just her word and a demand for money. She threatened to go public with the whole thing if I didn't pay, saying she'd ruin my business, my reputation, everything. I was completely blindsided. This was my aunt, someone who should have been family, someone who should have had my back. And here she was, trying to extort me for money over a baby that clearly wasn't mine. It was like something out of a nightmare. I immediately told her I wasn't giving her a dime without proof. I wasn't going to be blackmailed, especially by someone who clearly wasn't telling the truth. But that's when she really went off the rails. She started threatening to go to the media, to expose me as some kind of predator who had taken advantage of her. She even said she'd make sure Emma's nonprofit would be dragged into the scandal, that she'd ruin both of our lives if I didn't give her the money. I knew I couldn't just let her keep making these threats, so I decided to lawyer up. There was no way I was going to let her destroy everything Emma and I had built over a lie. I hired a lawyer, and we immediately filed a counterclaim against Lisa, accusing her of extortion and defamation. I wanted this whole thing shut down before it could even get started. But Lisa wasn't backing down. She actually filed a lawsuit against me, claiming I was the father of her unborn child and demanding child support. The whole thing was a circus. She refused to provide any evidence, no DNA test, no medical records, nothing. She just kept insisting that I was the father and that I owed her money. Meanwhile, my lawyer was trying to get the case dismissed, but Lisa's threats kept escalating. She started spreading rumors about me, telling people I was trying to deny the child and that I was abandoning my responsibilities. It was a complete nightmare. My reputation started taking a hit, and even though I knew the truth, it didn't stop the whispers and the side glances from people who didn't know the whole story. I was furious, but more than that, I was terrified. Terrified that she might actually succeed in destroying everything I'd worked for. The legal battle dragged on for months. Lisa kept dodging requests for a DNA test, always coming up with some excuse or delay. My lawyer kept pushing for it, knowing it was the only way to definitively prove that she was lying. But she was slippery. Every time we thought we were close to getting her to comply, she'd throw up another roadblock. It felt like I was stuck in this never-ending nightmare, constantly on edge, waiting for the next bombshell to drop. I was afraid to check my emails, afraid to answer my phone, because every time I did, it felt like more bad news was coming. But then, something happened that completely flipped the script. My lawyer got a call from an anonymous source, someone claiming they had information about Lisa. At first, we didn't know whether to trust it, but the source said they had evidence that Lisa had been involved in a long-term relationship with another man, a man who was, without a doubt, the real father of her child. They sent over documents, emails, and even photos that proved Lisa had been living with this guy for over a year, and that she'd been trying to pin the pregnancy on me as a way to get money because her boyfriend had financial problems. It was the break we needed. My lawyer immediately submitted the evidence to the court, and we demanded a DNA test once again. This time, with the evidence we had, the judge ordered Lisa to comply. She couldn't dodge it anymore. When the DNA results finally came back, they confirmed what I'd known all along. I wasn't the father. Lisa had lied about everything. I thought I'd feel relief when the results came in, but honestly, I just felt exhausted. The whole ordeal had drained me, mentally, emotionally, financially. I'd spent months fighting this ridiculous claim, and while I was glad it was finally over, the damage had already been done. People had heard the rumors, and even though I was cleared, not everyone would hear the truth. But Lisa? She didn't get away with it. After the DNA test, the court dismissed her lawsuit, and we immediately moved forward with our counterclaim. The judge ruled in my favor, and Lisa was ordered to pay damages for defamation and attempted extortion. She lost everything: her reputation, her credibility, and any chance of getting away with her scheme. I haven't seen or heard from her since the case was closed. From what I've heard through the grapevine, she left town and is laying low somewhere, trying to avoid the fallout from her lies. As for me, I'm still trying to rebuild. It's going to take time for the dust to settle, but at least now, I can finally breathe again.